Can you tell us a little bit about what you were trying to facilitate by creating a network through Gen of eco villages?
Yeah,
What was your
well, first
thinking
of
behind
all,
that?
one reason was in order to learn from each other, to exchange information on best practices and so forth. Um, but perhaps a larger reason was to feel that you're not just alone, working alone in a single project, isolated someplace. You are part of a larger group, a larger movement, people who have the same values, working towards the same um, end results in the long run. That we actually want to change the way society functions, and we feel that eventually this is a way that we're all going to have to live if we're going to live sustainably. So we might as well get started on a small scale. And our thinking was that if we are successful, if these villages, eco-villages are successful, then they will be replicated and they will become more mainstream. And this is what has been happening in the 30 years that have gone. It's much more mainstream now. Initially, it was considered sort of a hippie movement by some people. Today, in many places like here in Europe in particular, um, where I'm living here in Denmark, many municipalities are actively seeking out these people to form eco-villages, or also what we call co-housing. Co-housing is a very similar part of the movement, which is more focused on the social aspect. We say that in Gaia Education, which is part of the sister organization to GEN, that we have four different dimensions of life. We have the social, we have the ecological, the economic, and what we call the worldview, which is more the cultural, uh, spiritual aspect. And if you look at the social aspect, is the one which we find in the so-called co-housing movement, which started up back in the 1970s. In fact, I was a member of one of the very first ones here in Denmark. And early 90s, as we began to learn more about the climate crisis and the pollution and that sort of thing. And then the other dimensions, the economic dimension, of course, has always been there. And finally, what we call the worldview was relatively new, different from what the United Nations normally defines as the three dimensions. But we discovered that, particularly when we're working internationally, that spirituality means different things to different people. We have all these different religions, and some people who have no religion. And how do we communicate with each other and get them to understand that there are different ways of looking at it? And so to accept the idea that there are other people can have different views, but that does not make them less important or different. We have to accept all different religions and different spirituality views. And this is one of the characteristics of GEN, which I think is very, very important, because there are very few international organizations which have this kind of value system which cuts across religion and race and so forth. And so this is, I think, a good model for the future for the greater society.
And I think there is a 32 point, not plan, but there are 32 criteria or 32 principles of Gen. Is that correct? Or
Um, I wouldn't put it that way. I think the way GEN has evolved, uh, the various regions are quite autonomous, and the individual eco-villages are also very, very diverse. So it's not as if we have a standard that says in order to be an eco-village, you have to fulfill certain criteria. No, it's much more flexible, and there's no strict definition or saying you must do things in any one particular way. And in fact, they're very, very diverse, in different countries, different cultures. As I say, what the common thread, I think, is the value system, but the way that is implemented in a particular area can vary very considerably, what the practices are and so forth.
so
There's no standard formula.
if a project wants to be part of the Global Eco Village Network, there are no criteria that are used to understand that
It
project?
varies a little bit according to the uh, where you live in the world. Like in Europe, for example, they had like a two tier. membership. If you're going to be a voting member, you have to be of a certain size. Okay. Now, if there's only two couples and a dog, it's not enough. But you can still be a member, but you're not just a voting member. And in other areas in the Asia or America, again, they would have their own local rules. But generally speaking, we're not going to turn anyone away who's interested.
And if you're a member, what does that mean when you become a member of GEN? What does that mean for that community?
Well, it means basically that you can feel that you're part of something much larger than your own project, and you gain a lot of information. For example, on the GEN um, website, there are a lot of hints about how you can get started on a new eco-village, descriptions of what an eco-village is to many people. And we have what we call an incubation process for people who want to start a new eco-village, the kind of steps that we recommend that you go through, because this can be a very daunting task for a group who's inspired. How do we go about this? How do we do the financing? How do we get land? Do we need professional developers and all these sort of questions? And then we pool a lot of best practices also. And so if people can get access to a tremendous amount of information through the GEN website. And there have been an enormous number of studies being made also over the last 30 years, both master's degrees and PhDs and so forth, people analyzing the whole movement and what it means. And so you have a tremendous source of information available to anyone who wants to just do a little bit of digging, and either for doing research or for your own personal purposes.
And where does self-reliance or self-sufficiency play a role in an eco-village? Is that a
Yeah,
concept
that's clearly an objective, an ideal objective, because it's pretty much impossible to be totally self-sufficient. But there's one of the goals of any eco-village is to try to be as self-sufficient as possible under the circumstances. And for many eco-villages, it means trying to grow some of your own food, for example, and having some animals. But again, it varies quite a bit as to how successful you can be. And of course, the eco-villages are typically organic. They're avoiding all kinds of pesticides and herbicides and poisons in the earth. And this is a given thing. And of course, this is it almost goes without saying. This because nature, living in nature requires that you have to respect that you're not poisoning your food as we do in the main society. So these are.
What about economic systems? Are eco-villages developing their own internal new ways of?
Very diverse. I would say in most eco-villages I know of, normally each family or each individual is responsible for his or her own finances. There are a few eco-villages, not a great deal, but there are some who have what they call a sort of a common purse. They pool all their earnings into a one pot and split it equally. And so in some places this has worked for many years, including one famous one here in Denmark called Svanholm. They've done this for many years. There are other examples abroad in other countries. But as I say, in most cases, you're responsible for your own finances, your own earnings. And a lot of the eco-villages have some jobs on site in their village. But in many villages, you have people who have to commute to maybe the nearest city to work and then come back. Many of the, especially the larger eco-villages, typically have an educational program, a kind of outreach in their region. And eco-villages tend to be very open to the people in their regions and invite them often in for lectures and to talk about sustainability and so forth. So we feel that's why we have a very close relationship between GEN, the Global Eco-Village Network, and the sister organization, Gaia Education, which has developed educational programs based on these principles, both online and face-to-face. And a lot of these programs are held at eco-villages, and some are held at other institutions and universities and so forth.
Hmm. Interesting. So, how do you see the Gen or the eco-village movement in general transforming the mainstream kind of extractivist system that is imposed on us throughout the world? Because that system is based on exploiting ecological and human resources. So, how do
Yeah.
you see this
Well, as I
displacing it?
think I mentioned, I think the strategy is basically leading by example. The idea is that if we do this successfully, if we're able to find an alternative way of solving problems and of living, then it will be replicated. And this is what is happening. It's slowly, but it's much slower than I had hoped, perhaps 30 years ago, but it is happening. And there's still a lot of resistance from the mainstream society. There's very little understanding of the importance of such a movement in general in politics. Politicians are very much more focused on um, you know other problems. They don't think so much in terms of lifestyle as a strategy for change. But this is basically what the eco-village movement is. It's a lifestyle movement.